My dear friends, today I want to start by acknowledging something we all share, something that's an inevitable part of our human experience. We all go through hard times. None of us are immune to pain, loss, or suffering, and yet, these moments, difficult as they are, often shape us in ways that nothing else can. And I'm here today to remind you that these trials, these hard times, are not just random moments of suffering, they are purposeful. They are moments that God uses to help us grow. One of the most powerful voices on this subject was the great Christian thinker, C.SLewis. He was a man who deeply understood both the intellectual and emotional dimensions of faith, pain, and suffering. His own life was marked by immense personal loss and grief, yet through it all, he clung to the belief that God was at work in those dark times, refining and shaping him. Tonight, let us take a journey through Lewis's insights and wisdom, exploring how God uses hard times to help us grow. 1. The nature of suffering. Why do we suffer? Let's start with one of the most difficult questions we all face at some point: why does a loving God allow suffering? It's a question C.S.Lewis grappled with, both intellectually and personally. In his book The Problem of Pain, Lewis wrote, "Pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." When everything in life is smooth, when we are comfortable and content, it's easy to forget about God. We get caught up in the pleasures of life and, without realizing it, drift away from him. But when we are struck by pain, when life throws us into hardship, suddenly, we are brought to our knees. Pain forces us to confront the reality of our need for something greater than ourselves. Lewis saw suffering not as a cruel punishment, but as a necessary part of the human experience, something that, painful as it may be, is intended to awaken us. In other words, God uses our suffering to draw us back to him, to remind us that this world is not our ultimate home, and that we were made for something far greater. Imagine, for a moment, that you're living a perfectly comfortable life. Everything is going your way. You've got your health, your finances are in order, your relationships are solid. It's a nice picture, isn't it? But think about this: in that moment of comfort, how connected do you feel to God? How much do you lean on him? Most of us, if we're honest, tend to forget our dependence on God when things are easy. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine that everything falls apart. You lose your job, your health deteriorates, or a loved one passes away. Suddenly, the ground beneath you is shaky, and you find yourself crying out to God. You're desperate for his presence, his comfort, his guidance. It's in these moments of desperation that we often grow closer to God. Lewis wasn't suggesting that God delights in our suffering, far from it. But he did believe that suffering was often the means by which God breaks through the noise of our lives to get our attention. Pain wakes us up, and in doing so, it becomes a tool for growth. 2. The refiner's fire, transformation through adversity. In Mere Christianity, C.S.Lewis uses a vivid metaphor to describe how God works in our lives, especially through difficult times. He writes, "Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps, you can understand what he is doing. He is getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You knew that those jobs needed doing, and so you are not surprised. But presently he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to?" 3. Finding joy in the midst of suffering. One of the most difficult aspects of suffering is finding joy in the midst of it. How can we possibly be joyful when life seems to be falling apart? This is a question that C.S.Lewis grappled with deeply, especially after the death of his beloved wife, Joy David Mann. In his book A Grief Observed, Lewis writes with raw honesty about the depths of his pain and the challenge of reconciling his faith with his grief. He doesn't shy away from the reality of his suffering. He doesn't try to sugarcoat it or offer easy answers. Instead, he allows us to see the full weight of his grief and doubt. And yet, even in the midst of his pain, Lewis found moments of joy. Not happiness, necessarily, but a deeper, more profound joy that comes from knowing that we are not alone in our suffering. In Mere Christianity, Lewis wrote, "We are promised suffering. They were part of the program. We were even told, 'Blessed are they that mourn,' and I accept it. I've got nothing that I hadn't bargained for." Lewis understood that suffering was part of the human experience, and yet, he believed that joy was still possible, even in the darkest moments. This joy, he argued, comes from knowing that our suffering has a purpose, that God is with us in our pain and that He is using it to shape us into the people He created us to be. It's important to recognize that joy doesn't mean the absence of sorrow. Joy and sorrow often coexist. In fact, it's often in the midst of our deepest sorrow that we experience the most profound joy, the joy of knowing that we are not alone, that God is with us, and that He is working all things for our good. The explanation is that He is building quite a different house from the one you thought of, throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but He is building a palace. He intends to come and live in it Himself. What a powerful image. We often think that God's role is simply to fix the things we know are broken in our lives, to patch up the cracks in the walls or to repair the leaky roof. But God has a much grander vision for us. He doesn't just want to repair the small things, He wants to transform us entirely. And that transformation, Lewis reminds us, is often painful. Just as gold is refined by fire, so too are we refined by the trials we face. The fire burns away the impurities, leaving behind something pure, something stronger. But the refining process isn't pleasant. It's hot, it's uncomfortable, and at times, it feels unbearable. Yet it is precisely through this process that we become the people God intended us to be. Perhaps you've experienced this in your own life. Maybe you've gone through a season of intense hardship, and in the midst of it, you couldn't see how anything good could possibly come from it. But now, looking back, you can see how God was at work in that season, how He was shaping you, refining you, and preparing you for something greater. This refining process is not something that happens overnight. It's a lifelong journey. We will all face moments of intense pain, but each of these moments is an opportunity for growth. God is not content to leave us as we are. He is constantly working on us, building us into something more beautiful, more holy, more like Him. But as C.S.Lewis reminds us, we don't always get to know the answers. In The Problem of Pain, Lewis wrote, "We are not necessarily doubting that God will do the best for us, we are wondering how painful the best will turn out to be." It's hard to trust God's plan when we can't see the whole picture. But that's where faith comes in. Faith is trusting that God is good, even when our circumstances are not. Faith is believing that God is at work, even when we can't see it. Faith is trusting that God is using our pain for a purpose, even when we don't understand it. And here's the beautiful thing, even in the midst of our pain, even in the midst of our questions, God is with us. He doesn't abandon us in our suffering. He walks with us through it, offering us His comfort, His strength, and His peace. In A Grief Observed, Lewis writes about his struggle to understand why God allowed his wife to die. But even in his grief, he clung to the belief that God was with him. He wrote, "I need Christ, not something that resembles Him. I need Christ in His full glory, not just the comforting image." Lewis understood that, in the end, our hope is not in understanding why things happen, but in knowing that God is with us through it all. Our hope is not in answers, but in a person, in Jesus Christ, who suffered for us and with us. Conclusion: surrendering to God's will. As we come to the end of our time together, I want to leave you with this final thought: surrender. C.S.Lewis often spoke of the importance of surrendering our will to God's. In Mere Christianity, he wrote, "Give up yourself, and you will find your real self. Lose your life and you will save it. Submit to death, death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being, and you will find eternal life." So, how do we find this joy? First, by acknowledging our pain. We don't need to pretend that everything is okay. Lewis reminds us that it's okay to grieve, to feel sorrow, to wrestle with doubt. But we also need to keep our eyes fixed on the bigger picture. We need to trust that God is at work, even when we can't see it. 4. Overcoming fear and doubt. When we face hard times, one of the first emotions we often experience is fear. We fear the unknown, we fear loss, we fear pain. C.SLewis, in the Screwtape Letters, explores how fear can be used to keep us from trusting in God. In the book, the demon Screwtape advises his nephew, Wormwood, to use fear as a tool to manipulate humans and keep them from living out their faith. Fear, Lewis argues, is one of the most powerful tools the enemy can use against us. It paralyzes us, keeping us from stepping out in faith and trusting in God's plan. But over and over again, the Bible tells us, do not be afraid. God knows our tendency to fear, and He calls us to trust Him instead. In moments of fear and doubt, we need to remember that God is in control. He sees the bigger picture, even when we can't. And He promises to be with us, no matter what we face. One of the most profound ways we can overcome fear is by reminding ourselves of God's faithfulness in the past. Think back to a time in your life when you faced a difficult situation, but God brought you through it. Remember how He provided for you, how He comforted you, how He worked things out for your good. When we remind ourselves of God's faithfulness, it gives us the courage to trust Him in the present and the future. 5. Trusting God's plan, even when we don't understand. One of the most difficult aspects of suffering is that we don't always understand why it's happening. We want answers. We want to know why God is allowing this pain, and we want to see how it will all work out in the end. Surrender is not easy. It requires us to let go of our need for control, to trust God's plan even when we don't understand it, and to believe that He is using our pain for our good. But when we surrender, we find freedom. We find peace. And we find that, even in the midst of our hardest times, God is at work, shaping us into the people He created us to be. So today, I want to encourage you, whatever hard time you may be going through, trust that God is using it to help you grow. He is refining you, transforming you, and drawing you closer to Him. Let go of fear. Trust in His plan. And remember that you are never alone, God is with you, and He is using every moment of your life, even the painful ones, for your ultimate good. Thank you.